Hi everyone, today we're going to go over how you can make yeast at home from scratch. Before we start, let's talk about what yeast is. Yeast is an organism that can be found all over our planet. Specifically, we'll be talking about yeast in context of food. Yeast can help dough rise, provide specific flavors to baked goods, or carbonate some drinks like beer and wine. In our world, yeast can be found and is a eukaryote in the fungi kingdom. It is a single-celled organism that induces fermentation and is a model organism in various scientific experiments. So, how does yeast help our baked goods rise? Every time a baked good calls for dry yeast, this is yeast in its inactive form. The yeast can be awoken by adding water and is fed through the flour and sugar that are sometimes placed in our baked goods. The yeast cells eat the sugar and excrete CO2, giving air bubbles to pastries and allowing them to rise in height. This year, Cornell iGEM is taking on the project Oncurex. We are genetically modifying yeast to produce ursolic acid. We chose yeast as our model organism because it already exhibits the precursors of ursolic acid naturally. Using this lab, you can grow edible yeast at home to see the model organism up close. Today, we will be making yeast in the form of sourdough starter. Sourdough starter is used making flour, which is able to create yeast because it's a host to multiple dormant microorganisms. Different kinds of flours have different levels of these organisms within them. For example, wheat flours have a higher percentage of microorganism than bleached white flour. When we mix our water with these flours, yeast are activated and come to life, eating through their surroundings. Making sourdough starter will take various days. To start, you will need 1/2 cup of whole wheat flour and 1/4 cup of water. To feed the starter, you will need 1/2 cup of all-purpose flour and 1/4 cup of water. Throughout this process, you will also need a cup to place the starter in, a spoon to mix, and a rubber band to track where your yeast has grown to. Like I said before, making sourdough can be a lengthy process. The starter is made on day 1. Then on day 2 or 3, you can start feeding the starter by discarding a portion and adding the new slurry of flour and water. Then this process is repeated, and you know your sourdough is ready for baking after 3 or 4 rotations of feeding. On day 1, begin with your jar. Add 1/2 cup of whole wheat flour and 1/4 of a cup of water. Make sure to mix to incorporate. Next, loosely add on the top of your jar. Don't seal it too tight as the yeast need oxygen to breathe. After that, take a rubber band and place it to where the yeast comes to on the jar. This will allow you to track the growth of your yeast. On day 2, you might not see a lot of action with your jar. That's okay, that just means the yeast are starting to develop and grow. Keep your eye out for day 3. By day 3, you should be seeing some action in your yeast jar. This could come from the overall volume increasing or just some air bubbles being seen. If the mixture looks separated, that's completely normal. Day 3 is when we finally feed our sourdough. Begin the day by mixing the original jar. Next, grab a second container and place about half of the contents of the original jar into this container. The contents left over in the original jar can be discarded. However, if you're interested, you can look up fun recipes to use this discard in. After doing so, make sure to add 1/4 of a cup of water and 1/2 cup of flour into your new container. This is the new food for our yeast. Fully incorporate this mixture and then replace the cap back onto the jar. You can also replace the rubber band so you can continue tracking the growth. On day 4, you should notice substantial growth in your yeast. Repeat the steps from the previous day by mixing the original jar, dumping half the contents into a new jar, and then adding 1/4 of a cup of water and 1/2 cup of all-purpose flour into this new jar. Make sure to incorporate all of these ingredients and then replace your top and your rubber band. This sourdough starter is technically ready for baking. However, if you continue feeding the dough, it will develop in flavor and create an even more sour flavor in your bread. Thank you so much for following along with our science experiment today. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments, and we hope that you'll watch the rest of our videos. Enjoy!